Hello and welcome to the latest in our Scotland's Future series podcasts by the University of St Andrews. And today we're not looking at a particular Scotland's Future series podcast, but we are looking at a really important issue that many of you will have picked up in the media, which is the ongoing protests in Iran. And I'm really fortunate today to be joined by two Iranians, two experts. And I'm joined today by our University of St Andrews colleagues, Dina Nayeri, who's a writer of fiction and non-fiction, was a refugee from Iran, and also a lecturer in our School of English. Dina, welcome today. It's really good to have you here.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Not at all, thank you. And we're also joined by Professor Ali Ansari, who is a professor of Iranian history in the School of History. Ali, it's great to have you on.
Very good to be here.
Well, thank you. There's a lot going on in the world.
Mm-hmm.
Cost of living crisis, recession, Russia's war in Ukraine, yet we have these momentous events going on in Iran that are maybe not getting the attention that they might do at other times. Can you just for the benefit of people listening in, can you just talk to us a little bit about what's happening in Iran, what's the background, just give us an introduction to what people might be watching on their televisions?
Yes, I mean, this is the latest in a series of protests against the regime, which has sort of basically challenged the regime, at least since, I would trace it back to 2009, but this recent spate of protests probably began in 2017. We had some quite serious protests again in 2019, lots of casualties. This time, what's quite interesting about it is that the protest has been catalysed, has been sort of kick-started by, it's an overtly political protest, and it's about women's rights and the right to basically to choose whether you wear the Islamic veil. Mm-hmm. And this is sort of the death of a young Kurdish woman when she was arrested for apparently not wearing the veil properly. Has basically sparked the most extraordinary range of protests across the country. I think in breadth and depth, they are certainly, I think, the most serious challenge that the Islamic Republic has faced since its inception.
That's interesting. I want to come back to that about the serious challenge to the Islamic Republic. But Dina, I want you to talk about, Ali just touched upon these people are out protesting extraordinarily bravely. You're a refugee from Iran, you've got experience, you've still got friends and family in the country. Can you just give us a little bit of the human side of this? Because it's one thing to talk about, it's really important when we hear Ali talking about the history, but give us a sense of what's driving people to protest. What's the lived experience in Iran, not least for women who live there? That's something that I think people would be really interested to hear.
Sure. We've had this regime for about 43 years now, from the year I was born, actually. Yeah. It's the only Iran that I know. But it's very different from the Iran of my parents. And you know a little bit about the pre-Islamic Republic Iran. It's a very diverse place. It tends to be actually a kind of privately secular place. So people are, rooted kind of more in Persian culture and in its history and food and literature and music and all of these kind of very rich cultural things. And life in Iran, I guess, for most Iranians is something really nostalgic and really full of flavor and full of community and love. And so 43 years ago, when there were protests against the Shah, and very quickly, I guess, those protests and the revolution was kind of hijacked, and then we became an Islamic Republic. This, I think, was a shock to that generation, but also it completely changed the kind of Iran that we lived under, my generation lived in. I went to Islamic Republic school. I wore a very strict veil for 3 years. First, second, and third grade, I had the magnae, which is kind of the academic super scarf.
Sorry. Yeah. Second and third grade, what kind of age is that? Just for people who are used to the Scottish system.
Of course, the Scottish system. Yeah. So from the age of 6 to 8.
Wow. So as a 6-year-old?
Yes, as a 6-year-old, I was put under, and when I say the academic super scarf, I'm talking about not like the Jackie O look, but kind of, just like a scarf that covered everything, a straight hair, and the teachers would slap you on the wrist with a ruler. You tucked it in, it was sweaty and itchy, and then you also wore a manteau all the way to your feet. And, of course, I went to an all-girls school as well. We didn't have the benefit of an English or French education as our parents had, and then in private we would escape to these, the world of our parents, the private parties and and the food and the family all hidden away now, and so there's a bit of a cognitive kind of disconnect there, I think, for us and my generation. Who are we as Iranians, and why is it that in such a seemingly, I guess, modern country where my dad and all the men that I know wanted me to get an education as a woman, and where women are outspoken and they want to use their talents and they have this great education, why are we forced to be second-class citizens now and live under Sharia law and wear these degrading costumes that just basically make the male gaze our entire priority in life and in our, in our places of learning, and in our places in public places. And so I think for me, it was something that made me angry. It made all of my friends angry. It made my generation angry. And here we are now, and the generation that's younger than us is saying enough, and my generation too is going out there with them, with their daughters and mothers and sisters, and saying, we don't want this. Maybe we never wanted this. But, I don't think this is about a few more rights for women and about how the Islamic Republic treats women and women's rights. I think it's about getting free from under religious law altogether.
So, I think that's absolutely right. But can I just read?
Please,
There's a couple of things I just to reinforce what Dina said. I mean, I don't think it's principally about the veil. I mean, the veil is symbolic of a wider issue that women are treated as second-class citizens in the country, and they don't want it. So some of the protests have actually been by quite religious women who've said, we don't want to be treated like slaves in our own country. I mean, it's got nothing to do with them about removing the veil. But I think also Dina's absolutely right that it's much broader than this. I mean, I think this is the sort of the tip of the spear, that what you're seeing here is a fight for rights, and it's a sort of a fight for almost a possibility of living things that we take for granted. The possibility of living your life with a degree of safety and security in your own country without being constantly bothered by people telling you how to think, how to dress, how to look, these various things. And I think that it's very interesting that a younger generation who've known nothing but the Islamic Republic, but more than that, have known nothing but the Islamic Republic at a particularly repressive time, have now come out, 16, 17-year-olds and saying, we don't want this.
But they also see the world, I think, through their phones, and they understand how the rest of the world lives.
So this is really important, and I want to come back to this about how that younger generation see the world.
Connect.
And that's really important. Can I just to give people the fuller picture, and you said something really interesting about pre-1979 Iran. I want to ask Ali about because
I'm old enough.
Well, and you were born in the year of the revolution. Ali, you weren't.
That's right.
Sorry to age you right off the bat there, Ali.
Right.
But I think one thing that's really important here is that there may be some people thinking they'll watch scenes from Iran, it's been 43 years, and they'll think, well, it's always been like that. But it wasn't always like that. Can you just, Ali, I'm going to ask you first, can you just paint us a bit of a picture about what was Iran like pre-1979? And I think, Dina, you referred to the Iran that your mum and dad would have known, of your parents, your grandparents' generation.
So, I mean, Iran went through a process of modernization, throughout the 20th century. I mean, not all of it perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but what you had was a degree of secularization. You had obviously the removal of the veil. You had, a certain amount of emancipation, shall we say? And yes, while it was politically, I think we have to be realistic about it. I mean, obviously politically it was quite restrictive certainly in the late Pahlavi period, the late Shah. But in sort of social terms, it was much more liberal. I mean, in social terms, certainly. It was a place where people were quite used to not wearing, these sort of restrictive Islamic dress. Now, in the 60s and 70s, or certainly in the run up to the Islamic Revolution itself, the last sort of government before the revolution basically allowed people to decide. There were people who did wear the veil. There were people who didn't wear the veil. It wasn't. They didn't assume a French model, shall we say, of being very sort of instructive about what you could and could not wear. But then, obviously, after the revolution, what was interesting was that the revolution was not fought over this issue of actually imposing the veil. They suddenly decided after the revolution they would, and one of the first demonstrations against Ayatollah Khomeini was actually women. I mean, women coming out and saying, hang on a minute, this is not the revolution we fought for. So, the process of reveiling women in that sense was a process that really occurred during, the early years of the Islamic Revolution and war, so they used the war as an excuse to basically impose.
So this reveiling of women, the first demonstrations, talk to us about, you've talked about your school. Tell us a little bit, what's it like to be a woman in Iran nowadays, or what was it like to be a woman in Iran in the 90s, the noughties, Paint us a picture of it,
I think the word I would use would be in many ways confusing. And I think I think it is because we are told so many different stories about who we are. One of the earliest memories that I have of hijab is, I have a family that comes from, half of them come from a city and half from a village. My father's family live in a village, and it's very provincial. And I would go to the village on the weekends, and my grandmother wore a kind of provincial veil. It wasn't the Islamic Republic veil, but it was one with flowers, etc. There were a pile of the other, chadors for people to pick up and put on, the house chadors, and the women wore them. And I started to follow her around and put on this veil as a plaything. It was a comfort. Yeah. And, at the same time, this was shortly after all of these protests had happened and the women had been reveiled, as Ali said. And my mother was so very upset. My mother was a doctor. She was very well educated, and she was very newly forced under the veil in her 20s. And she kept seeing this happen, and one day she walked in as me and my grandma were playing, and she tore that veil in two and walked out. And I think that story really shows what women felt. Here was a person with an MD. Here was a person who wanted to work and live and determine her own life, and her daughter was taking the symbol of this thing that she hated, which shouldn't be the symbol of that. It should be the symbol of, like, say, my grandmother's life and her choices and her her personal religion, etc. And here this was kind of being thrown in her face. I think in that sense it was very confusing for her. It was very confusing for me growing up, because there was this constant, narrative of you're going to determine your own life, you're going to have a career, you're going to make your mark in the world. But at the same time, the government was saying something very different. This is how you must dress. You are inferior to men. You're second-class citizens. Your word is less in court. You have less property. And I think it's just very hard and very degrading. I had a little brother too, and I watched him go to school before we escaped the country. And, I just kept asking myself, why? Why does he get to be treated this way, and I have to be treated this other way? When you say privately that all that matters is how hardworking we are and how clever we are and how and what we do with our days.
So I'm going to ask Ali in a moment about, you talked about that, the grave threat. But before I do that, I want you to talk, the grave threat is coming from these demonstrations. So, Dina, before I go to Ali, just to build on a point you made earlier on, can you tell me what's driving these young women, actually not just young women, but young men and people from every part of society, to put their lives on the line and sometimes pay the ultimate penalty? Can you talk us through a little bit of that? And don't hold back. I think it's useful for people to
have I
to
been
be
holding
aware.
back?
No, you haven't held back the slides. No, but I think it's useful for people to be aware of the brutality that they're facing and the risks that they're putting. No, this is not. It's not like you or I go out campaigning in the streets here. They're putting their lives on the line.
Yeah, and I think we're just done with the kind of the malocracy.
Say that again. Go. You were done with
the malocracy.
The malocracy. Yeah.
We are done. This wasn't what we wanted, and I'll give you a little bit of context in a minute. But when I was a kid, there was one day when my mother, we were in a car, and my brother, in the middle of traffic, ran out into the street, and she ran out after him. Her veil slipped. The morality police came and immediately yanked her out of the car and started berating her. This happens all the time, and we've had enough. The women have had enough. The men have had enough. We want to live a modern life. And the context that I wanted to tell you a little bit about is, I actually wrote a piece about this recently in New York Magazine. But I think a lot of people
tell us about the piece if anybody's looking for it.
It's called if you Google my name and secularism in Iran, it's called Why Is It So Hard to Believe in a Secular Iran? In New York Magazine a couple of weeks ago. But I think most Western people believe that Iran is a religious population, a deeply religious population, and it's easy to believe that because you see that they have a theocracy in place. But of course, people don't delve delve into the history of how that theocracy came to be. Now, over the years, a lot of very well-respected surveyists have gone to Iran and have tried to figure out how religious the population is. For example, Gallup and Pew and the World Values Survey all said that Iran is highly, highly religious, like in the 90s, something that does not mesh with the people's experience, because we all know that everyone has kind of a display Quran that they wave around when the moral police visit, but really, we're a very diverse nation, a very modern nation, there's a lot of secular people in our country. So recently, and what the piece is about, is there was a couple of researchers in the Netherlands who decided the reason we're getting these kind of results is because Gallup and Pew and World Values Survey, they go door to door and they ask people in a theocracy, how religious are you? Which is absolutely absurd, because people aren't going to tell the truth in that instance. You don't know if that's an agent of the Islamic Republic. So
that's a really interesting comment on polling. Really interesting.
Isn't it? And it's a well-documented problem with polling in places like Russia and China and Iran. And the problem, though, is that they feel they have to go for face-to-face in order to get a representative sample and not have people self-selecting in. Well, these academics actually went and did a viral online survey, and they corrected in the ways that, Pew said are actually really rigorous. They corrected their data to make sure it represents the whole population, and lo and behold, what did it show? Not a religious population, a population that's actually widely secular. And I won't go into more detail on that, except to say that the Islamic Republic is not what a free people of Iran would choose for themselves. It's not the government that represents them that they would want, and I think that's what's happening now, a reaction to that. They want something that they've chosen that represents them.
Well, that leads us nicely on to the point I asked Ali to build on, which is, you mentioned this point about this being a really significant threat. Can you just build upon that? Building on what Dina's outlined to us too.
I think the important thing to stress here for listeners as well is that this is building on a series of protests. This doesn't come out of nowhere. It's not just it's not the first time the Islamic Republic is facing a sort of a protest of its population. I mean, we had enormous protests back in 2009 with the Green Movement. And since then we have had a series of protests. Even in between the sort of more violent protests that have taken place, there have been strikes, people haven't been paid, the economy's in a mess, there's massive mismanagement. They haven't been able to resolve their nuclear dispute with the West. It's heavily sanctioned, obviously. But I think fundamentally what people are fed up with is that the government is corrupt. I mean, it is massively corrupt. And, they're fed up with it. And I think, Dina sort of expressed it very well. I mean, people are just simply angry. They're angry at this. And if you look at some of the commentary coming out now, what's very striking also is that it's now spread, there are very popular figures in Iran, sports people, actors, others, all coming out in support of the demonstrators and voicing some pretty, hard-headed commentary. And for me, certainly as someone who's studied Iran for a long time, what I find very striking is that the motifs, the arguments they're using are all very strongly nationalist. I mean, they are Persian sort of idioms that people are using. There's nothing Islamic about this at all. So 10 years ago, if you were looking at the demonstrations then, people would go out onto the terraces and shout, "God is great," as a way of challenging the government. Now nobody is shouting "God is great." People are basically saying, that we love our country, Iran. We are together. We want to take our country back. Interestingly enough, it's a fascinating sort of extension, in a sense, of a protest movement. And I suppose from the other side, the government seems to have no response to it. I mean, this is the thing, other than shooting people. I mean, that's basically
So that's interesting. Can I just build on that with you for a moment? So could you talk to me a little bit about the demographics in Iran that people might not be aware of? What's Iran look like?
Well,
its
I mean,
and just secondly,
it is young.
It is young.
It is a young demographic.
So that's interesting. So it's young. And talk to me a little bit more about the government response to this young population who are protesting.
Well, you see, the government. So basically, I think the protests are undeniably now being led in many ways by younger people. I wouldn't want to overemphasize that sort of demographic element, because we've had a very young population for quite a while.
Okay, fair
and
enough.
then, to be honest, in some ways, these have, in some cases, previously they've petered out or they've been crushed.
Okay.
But nonetheless, that demography is quite interesting, and for me, it's certainly interesting that a group of people, as I said, who have known nothing but the Islamic Republic and have been fed nothing but indoctrination by the Islamic Republic have still come out, and protest for values that we find very familiar.
Yeah.
The government's attitude really, and this is an angle we haven't really looked at yet, is that it's really doubled down on an ideology which is basically sees everything as foreign inspired, sees everything as being sort of like some sort of conspiracy, doesn't see itself as responsible at all really for what's going on. Some people do say things, to be honest, but ultimately they think, if you listen to the supreme leader, the chap in charge, he says this is all being, scurrilously, the British, the Americans, the Zionists, whoever else, Saudis, whatever else you want to do. It's all to do with them. And then the other interesting thing about them, of course, in the last 6 months, which has added a further dimension, I think, to this whole protest, is they've also doubled down in their support of Putin. So you've got this really peculiar situation where the Iranians are now, almost in some sort of like symbiotic relationship with Putin, who's also got this sort of but a sort of a loathing of the West. And this sort of Iran-Russia axis is quite interesting on that, and they see the internal problems as really foreign-inspired. Whereas, of course, for most Iranians, that's not the case at all.
So, Dina, what are your friends telling you about the point Sally raises there about corruption, about a government that's seen as increasingly out of touch and aligning itself to Putin and other autocratic regimes?
I feel like what I'm hearing from Iranians inside Iran, it meshes really well with everything that Ali is saying. I think the thing that they're worried about, the thing that upsets them, is that they think that the West misunderstands them and what they want. And I think part of the problem is that, because of the fact that the Islamic Republic kind of spews this disdain for the West and Western-born ideas, they're afraid that then Western people are always kind of saying, well, the Islamic Republic will respect a grassroots effort, but they won't respect if we, have any kind of intervention or if we say anything. But that's exactly what the Islamic Republic wants, because they're going to call everything, foreign-born. They're never going to admit that this is something that is very much rooted in Iran. It's very much rooted in Iranian frustrations. And so I think most of what I've been hearing is Iranians saying things like, why is the Western media, why is the Western public misunderstanding us so fundamentally, misunderstanding what we want, misunderstanding that what we want is exactly what they would choose for themselves, not
so
really,
that common humanity and wanting the same thing.
Exactly. And I have to say, a lot of times I think in the West there's a little bit of a fear of seeming Islamophobic, if you criticize too much. Well,
That's interesting, you're both agreeing on that.
I've actually talked to, early on when I was trying to talk to a couple of journalists, and they said, one of them actually asked me, and they said, we thought that the veil was part of Iranian culture. And we thought that, and I would sort of say, well,
for anybody listening to this, you're not quite getting Dina's facial expression.
I was sort of saying that I don't know where you got that impression from. I know where you got that impression from, but for me, it was quite interesting that there was a sort of I wouldn't say a steep learning curve, but they certainly had to catch up because people haven't been looking at Iran, as you quite rightly said when we started this. People have been looking elsewhere.
Well, that's why we're doing this. Yeah. Look, we don't have too much time, so I want to can I firstly, and it would be remiss of me not to do this, Dina, you and your family fled the regime, and I know we're talking about Iran, but given everything that's going on, can you talk to us, just given limited time, I see your badge, talk to us a little bit about, why you fled and what were your lived experiences as a refugee? And I have to say, and please give a plug for your excellent book, which I think everybody should read as well, in terms of just getting an idea about refugees and why people become refugees in that experience.
Happy to. So we were, as I said, I was born in Iran and lived there 8 years throughout the war. But during that time, my mother converted to Christianity. And while there's a lot of different religious minorities who get different amounts of persecution, I guess, in Iran, being a Muslim who converts is pretty much the worst.
It's pretty bad.
It's pretty bad. And so my mother was arrested. She was threatened with execution. There was a lot that happened. And so we ran. At first, I guess, we just went to Dubai as tourists, and we blew through that visa and applied for refugee status, and then we lived in refugee camps, and we were on our way, I guess, between Iran and America for 16 months before we were accepted. And so the badge that I'm wearing is Refugee Support Europe. It's an organization that I love very much, and I'm a trustee of that organization. because their mission is to provide aid with dignity. One of the things that I noticed, my mom noticed, we all noticed when we became refugees, is just how much our status in the world had fallen. How, we were respected people before, an academic family, and suddenly we were just displaced people without a home. Often people threw cans of food in a parking lot and, old clothes and things. And so refugee support provides all of the things that refugees need, but with dignity and beautiful stores. And I actually write about them in my last book, The Ungrateful Refugee, where I talk about this experience. And then a little bit, I guess, in my next book, which is called Who Gets Believed, which is coming out in March.
Good, thank you for that. Ali, just at the end, I'm going to ask each of you a quick question. Ali, difficult question to ask. People are watching this. What comes next? What should we be looking out for in Iran?
Well, the first thing I'll say is that despite the fact that we all live in this very accelerated social media world, these are processes and not events. So I think people get very they sort of say, what's going to happen tomorrow? Will it happen? I'd say no. I mean, if you look historically, the historical experience in Iran is these often take a year, 18 months, whatever. I mean, there's a process that takes place. And of course, this could be longer, it could be shorter. I've often argued, and I'll argue again, that in my view, the Islamic Republic of Iran, mental fatigue has set in. Now, what does that mean? It means it could unravel tomorrow, it could unravel later on, but that's a fact. I think that, for me, there is light at the end of the tunnel, but it's going to be a long tunnel, is basically. And I think people that need to pace themselves for what's happening. The current regime really has nowhere to go, so it and it's got its backs against the wall. So I think it's very difficult to see this happening in a shall we say a smooth and rapid process.
Okay, just one last question for you. And look, as we started, a lot going on in the world. People have got limited attention. We understand that. People are listening to this and they want to know more. What would you recommend come on, give us some reading and listening material, Ali.
Well, I mean, apart from Dina's books.
Of course, all of Dina's books. And don't be modest.
Don't be modest. Well, I mean, I will say this, and I think I'll say this actually. My late colleague, Michael Axworthy, wrote a fantastic book called Empire of the Mind. And I think it's a wonderful book covering the history of Iran from, Zoroaster to the present. That's a wonderful book. And for those who'd like a slightly shorter version, they can have a look at my own very short introduction, but that is very short and quite different. But yeah, I would recommend actually Michael's book. I think for someone who really wants to get a sort of a good, thorough, understanding of the country, where it's come from, and where we think it might be going.
Thank you.
People keep giving me that book for Christmas, by the way. I have 5 copies.
5 copies. Well, that's reassuring. I'll take one. Dina, last word to you. You're in touch with friends and family. You have that lived experience as a refugee. What if people are listening to this podcast and you want them to remember something from it? What would be your final message to people who are listening in on this about what's going on in Iran? I
would say don't confuse the message or misunderstand the message. And this isn't some small thing that's happening about like some little statute or whatever. Continue, this is a revolution, and hopefully, what we hope for is that this will be the end of the Islamic Republic. Please keep your attention on these stories. Please don't look away. It just breaks my heart to watch it drop in the headlines, for other things that feel much, much less important, I think, to world history. And so I think the thing I would tell everyone to do is keep reading about Iran, keep supporting Iranians, and I guess try to pressure your governments to help them. Yeah, that's a really good way. Ali, Dina, I thought that was really illuminating. I wish we had longer, but thank you so much for taking the time.
Exactly. Stephen, we could have gone on forever.
I know you could have done. That's
I was going to tell you. I was going to quickly ask you. Did you see the woman who wore the Zoroastrian necklace on Iranian television
No.
This was a couple of years ago. So, what Ali was saying about the,
No, they're going around with banners and
stuff.
Very, very. I mean, it's quite interesting on the nationalist stuff.
It's really, really interesting.
It is.
And actually, I have to say, reflective of the rich and diverse community that we're lucky to have in St Andrews, where we've got so many Iranians here too, and we had the vigil recently as well. So
really wonderful.
Great to have you both here today. Thank you.
Great, thank you.
Thanks.
And thanks to you for listening in today.